Hi guys, one of the things that I believe is that everyone has a story, and I believe that no matter who you are, your story is powerful. And one of the main reasons your story, your personal story is powerful is because it's a summation of who you are, and it also, it not only sums up who you are, it tells you who you are. And of course we're always changing and we grow and we mature, but our stories, as well as kind of telling us who we are and being a summation of who we are, they also shape who we are and who we are becoming. And that's the power of stories. But it's not just your story telling you who you are. There's bigger stories as well, meta stories. And there's people and organizations, they all kind of want to tell you what their story is because of the shaping power of stories. They want to shape you and form you as well. And some of these bigger stories, these meta stories, are the story of our culture, of government, of our workplaces, of our parents, of our families. Families are very powerful, and the stories in shaping who we are. And of course, marketing companies, they're trying to make a buck of shaping our purchasing decisions. So some of these meta stories are very helpful, and some of these meta stories, bigger stories, are less so. And I actually personally think that God has a story. And I think God's story is the ultimate meta story, the ultimate big story. And it tells us who we are, and it's meant to shape us into who we can become. And I think that the story of us, the story of humanity inside the story of God, is probably a little bit different to what you're thinking. Inside the story of God, I believe, is the story of us. And it reveals facets of our identity. And one of those facets of our identity that it reveals is that we are royal. We have a royal identity. And I actually think it's worth investigating what the story of God says about us. Our identity is a huge part of who we are. You can argue our identity is who we are. And sometimes, maybe even often, just in our modern day 21st century life in Melbourne, sometimes even often, we have to prove who we are. We have to show people our identity. We have to bust out a driver's license or our Medicare card or our passport. But identity is more than just legal. It relates to our being. As I was saying before, you can argue that our identity is who we are. And not only does it relate to our being, it relates to our purpose. And people, they can act differently when they go through an identity crisis. So identity really ties into not just our legally defining who we are or socially defining who we are. It actually defines kind of what drives us and what motivates us. And when it changes, it can, and even if it doesn't change, our identity actually impacts our actions, what we do. And so we've looked at already, this is kind of like the third part, the third series in this idea of identity. We've looked at a priestly identity. So in our priestly series, we looked at our identity as representatives of God, that we represent God, that we stand between two parties, that as human beings, we stand between God and the rest of creation. And being priestly means that we bring blessings and we carry God's name and we carry our neighbors' names into the presence of God. So that's our priestly identity. And then we looked at our prophetic identity. In our prophetic series, we saw that our identity is also a counter-rebellion, a rebellion that's taken place against God, but according to God's story. But our prophetic identity is God's counter-rebellion to the brokenness in the world. And in our prophetic identity, we lament exploitation and we speak out against injustice and we speak truth to power and we represent God's heart and God's name to a world that's broken. And so in this series, wrapping it up, we've looked at priestly, we've looked at prophetic, and now we're looking at our raw identity, which is woven throughout God's story, climaxing in Jesus as the true King. And I believe that our raw identity kind of provides a framework or the context for our other identities. So let's look at this big story, this meta story. Let's look at the story of God, and we're going to look at a book of the Bible called Exodus, and Exodus chapter 19. I'm going to read out some verses and we'll discuss it. So Exodus chapter 19, verse 1. On the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although this whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So this passage, Exodus chapter 19, this passage from the Bible comes at an interesting time in the history of the people of God. And the people of God, the Israelites, have just recently been freed from slavery and exploitation in Egypt through God's miraculous intervention. And now they're about to enter the Sinai desert. So here they are in this transition period from slavery to freedom at the start of a desert journey. And God says to Moses, the leader of Israel, "Tell my people that this is how I see them. Tell my people that this is who they are. Speak this identity over them. I don't want them to have an old identity. I don't want them to have a false identity. I want them to have the identity that I see of who they are. I want them to have a real identity." And this passage we know is important because it's also referenced in the New Testament. So let me read to you from the New Testament in the Bible, the story of God, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, just the first part. And it says, Peter is writing to a group of Christians undergoing kind of social exclusion, marginalization, low levels of persecution in the Roman province of Asia Minor, now the modern nation of Turkey. And this is what he writes to them. And they're going through stuff as well, just like Israel was going through things. And he speaks this identity over God's people. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. And so this verse that Peter writes to early Christians undergoing difficult times in Turkey 2,000 years ago, this verse written by Peter is an allusion to Exodus 19 that was spoken, allusion to the identity in Exodus 19 that was spoken over Israel. But now he's kind of appropriating what was for the nation of Israel, the people of God, and now he is appropriating that identity for all the ethnicities following Jesus, who are now added to the people of God. And just to break it down a little bit, this idea of being a chosen people, you know, that speaks to an identity of being wanted. That speaks to an identity of being selected out of a group and saying, you know, maybe you're rejected by the culture, maybe you're rejected by society, but you are wanted by God. And it also speaks to being set apart. This idea of being set apart for a relationship, being chosen is special, right? And when we think about how we're chosen, then I think we should also think about what are we chosen for? And then the part in 1 Peter 2:9 where it talks about we're a holy nation, you know, we are. And I think about our faith community, that we are a holy nation, which is not as the nations of the world conceive of nations, but it's really a holy nation. You are a holy nation. God's people are a holy nation. It's the multilingual, multicultural, multi-generational, multi-ethnic nation of God. And this idea is powerful. The idea of a holy nation, that's our identity. It's powerful, especially when we think of holiness primarily as a relational word. You know, we can think of holiness in multiple ways, but I think primarily it's relational. Obviously, there's moral implications, there's implications for our actions, and the morality aspect of holiness is important. But I think the order in which we think about this idea that we are a holy nation, which one is primary, that's critical. If we think of ourselves as primarily a relational nation set apart for God, chosen from the nations of the world, then that's powerful. If we get that order confused and we think of our holiness as primarily moral, then that's when we can start to put up boundaries, and there can be a temptation to think about us and them. When we think about holiness as a relational word, I know who I'm connected to, and I know why I'm connected to, set apart to this God. It's actually to invite the nations in, to participate in this nationhood, this holy nationhood. And so when the emphasis gets confused on this idea of holiness, then things can go awry. But back to what Peter is alluding to in Exodus chapter 19, he tells us, New Testament believers, that our identity as followers of Jesus is we've been set apart for relational intimacy with God. And out of this relationship flows actions that match his heart and his character. And Peter goes on to say, in the rest of 1 Peter verse 2, verse 9, that we are God's special possession. And here comes the reason why, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. And so this idea of a special possession. And if we go back to Exodus 19, Peter is alluding to the Hebrew term treasured possession. Treasured possession in Exodus 19, special possession in 1 Peter 2. And there's this idea of the Hebrew word for treasured possession in Exodus 19 is the Hebrew word segula. And it originally referred to like a family heirloom that's a special object and kind of represents the family. And then later on it came to also be a covenantal term between two parties, between the king and the one who follows the king. And the king says to this particular follower, you are my special possession. You are my segula. The segula is chosen to represent the king. And they have a special role to play. Special possession with a special role. A treasured possession with a treasured role. They are authorized to sign off on the king's behalf. And so if we put all this together, as priests, but not just priests, as royal priests, belonging to the king's family, being identified as his special or treasured possession, as followers of Jesus, we bear the power and authority that he carries, so that we can proclaim the praises of him who called us out of darkness and into his marvelous light. And so this royalty is tied up in being chosen to belong to God's royal family. It's tied up in being a special possession, representing a royal family. It's tied up in being a holy nation, being part of a diverse group of people that have a new identity in Jesus. And there's a few ways I think that we can think of this royalty. And maybe we can even, maybe on the negative side or the more selfish side, we can think of perhaps modern day examples of royal family members where they have maybe abused that royal identity, and they've seen the royal identity as about privilege and entitlement. And there's this sense of, because of the accident of my birth, I'm better actually, and I should be treated as if I'm better. So that's on the one side. So we can see that in maybe some examples in our culture of royalty that think about their royal identity as about privilege and entitlement. But I think that in the story of us, found inside the story of God, that it reveals to us that yes, there is power and there is privilege that comes with our royal identity, being royal priests. But that privilege and that power is not about entitlement. It's actually about empowerment for the service of others. I don't know what you think about that. We'll discuss these things soon. But going back to Exodus 19, it says in verses 5 and 6, although the whole earth is mine, you'll be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So maybe just to wrap up and to tie these three facets of our new identity as we become followers of Jesus. The three facets being our priestly identity, our prophetic identity, and our royal identity. So in the first part of God's story, the story of creation, our priestly identity emerges as creation is established. we were, according to the story of God, we were made as human beings in the image of God to represent him to the rest of the creation, and to represent the rest of the creation back to God, to cultivate worship for God from creation, to present it to him. And everything's great in the first part of God's story. In the second part of God's story, it's the story of humans betraying God and rebelling against him, and how that introduces brokenness and corruption into everything that God made good. And so in the second part of God's story, our prophetic identity, first part of God's story, priestly identity, second part of God's story, our prophetic identity calls and is instituted for humans to respond as a counter-rebellion. Humans who walk in their prophetic identity confront injustice and confront exploitation, and they call others to leave the brokenness of the way they're living life and to experience the flourishing of life that God has for all of us. So we see that in the first two parts of God's story. But our royal identity is a little bit different to the first two. It's kind of woven all throughout all five parts of God's story. Our royal identity in some ways is kind of the capstone that ties the others together, and in some ways motivates and empowers and encourages us. Carrying out, because when you know that you're royal, you carry yourself a bit differently, even as you're carrying out priestly duties. When you know that you're royal, you are able to persist even as you carry out your prophetic role. Carrying out our priestly duties feels different when you know that you're royal, when you know that you're royalty, when you know that your Father is the King. Moving in our prophetic identity feels different when it comes from this surety that we are royal. These concepts, we're going to unpack them. This is kind of a bit of an introduction, but they will be unpacked as we go through the series. But I wonder if I've hopefully provoked some thinking. And maybe you agree with some parts, maybe you disagree with some parts, that's fine. And we're going to have some questions here, and we'd love to find out what you think somehow. So some discussion questions, and this is just to get the conversation going. And maybe it might go off in one direction or another. It's all good. Just love to hear your thoughts. So first set of questions is, when you hear the word royal, what's the stereotype that you have? What immediately comes to mind? Is it privilege? Is it power? Is it responsibility? Is it service? Is it something else? And I made mention of this concept of royalty. It can be sometimes seen as maybe entitlement, or on one hand, or maybe royalty can be seen as, yes, there's power and privilege, but it's for the service of others. Do you think that kind of dichotomy, that spectrum is real? Do you see that in those two versions of approaches to royalty at work in the world today? Second group of questions. Why do you think that God speaks identity over Israel after coming out of slavery and as they're about to enter a desert journey? And what do you think, what difference did it make, or what impact was there when God called these newly freed slaves his treasured possession, his shegulah, this special kind of people representing him to the rest of the world? What might that do to a nation that had been held in slavery for 400 years? And maybe, what do you think about how Peter applies Exodus 19, spoken to the nation of Israel, the people of God, and then he applies it to all these ethnicities, all these backgrounds, to the expanded people of God in the New Testament? What do you think that says about the kind of community the church, the people of God, is meant to be? And then finally, how does knowing that you are royal change the way you think about serving others, if at all? How does knowing that you're royal, that this is a biblical facet of your identity as a human being, how does that change the way you think about praying for others, or speaking up about injustice, or speaking blessing over people, the priestly or the prophetic role that we have? And what would it look like, do you think, this week for you to live out a royal identity shaped by Jesus rather than by status or entitlement. Anyway, some food for thought. Love to hear your feedback. And that's all for me. Thanks, guys.